Excuse me. Has anyone seen my mommy? I can speak 16 languages.
16? 16?
8 men sat around a table long enough for a wedding party, and every one of them understood that silence was a weapon in this room. Kang Jun-hyun did not raise his voice. He never needed to. When he spoke, contracts moved, borders shifted, and men who displeased him simply stopped being mentioned again. Tonight he was discussing a shipment that mattered more than any of them realized, his finger tracing a line across a folder no one else was permitted to touch. Then the elevator chimed. Every head turned at once. Hands drifted toward jackets. Chairs scraped back a half-inch. The doors slid open on a small girl clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, her sneakers squeaking against marble that cost more than most apartments in the city. She scanned the room with the mild irritation of someone checking the wrong classroom. "Excuse me," she said. "Has anyone seen my mommy?" Nobody answered. One of the younger men let out a startled laugh, quickly swallowed when Jun-hyun's eyes cut toward him. Another leaned down, voice gentler than any of them had used in years, and told her she'd wandered somewhere she shouldn't be. The girl considered this, unbothered, and folded her arms the way adults do when they're preparing to negotiate. "I can speak 16 languages," she announced. Laughter broke out around the table, sharp and disbelieving. Jun-hyun did not laugh. He studied her the way he studied balance sheets that didn't add up, searching for the trick, the angle, the reason a child would walk into the most dangerous room in Seoul and say something like that with total confidence. 16, he repeated. She nodded, entirely serious. He switched languages without warning. A clipped phrase in Mandarin thrown across the table like a blade to see if it would land. She answered without hesitation, her accent clean. He shifted to French. She answered again. Russian. Answered. Portuguese. Answered, this time correcting a word he'd deliberately gotten wrong. The room that had been full of low murmurs and shifting chairs went utterly still. 8 grown men who had watched each other kill without flinching now stared at a 6-year-old like she'd rewritten the rules of the world. Jun-hyun leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Who taught you?" The girl smiled, the kind of smile that had no idea it was about to detonate an empire's worth of assumptions. "My mommy. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because this story only grows heavier and more emotional from here. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight, because people from every continent end up in this room together. And if you're already one of us, smash that like button before we rewind, because the woman nobody in that building had bothered to notice is about to become the whole reason this story exists. 6 hours earlier, at 4:45 in the morning, while the city outside her window was still drowning in darkness, Jasmine Carter was already awake. She had barely slept. 4 hours, maybe less. The kind of sleep that leaves a residue of exhaustion instead of relief. She moved through her small apartment with the practiced silence of someone who had done this exact routine 1,000 mornings in a row, careful not to wake the 6-year-old curled beneath a blanket covered in cartoon foxes. She scrambled eggs. Packed a lunch with a note tucked inside, the same note in a different language every day, because Zuri had once asked her to, and Jasmine had never once said no to that particular request. She laid out a small uniform, checked the weather, checked the clock. Then, because she couldn't stop herself, she checked her bank account. $47.23. She stared at the number the way a person stares at a wound they already know is there, confirming the pain rather than discovering it. Rent was due in 6 days. Zuri's school had sent a notice about supplemental fees. The refrigerator was making a sound it shouldn't be making. The last of her medication had run out 2 weeks ago, and she had decided, without discussing it with anyone, that headaches were survivable and refills were optional. She closed the app. She pressed her palms flat against the counter and breathed, the way she always did, the way that had become less a coping mechanism and more a ritual of self-persuasion. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. She always said that. She had been saying that since Zuri was 2 years old, and her daughter's father had packed a duffel bag and vanished into a version of freedom that didn't include either of them. She had said it through eviction notices, through a hospital bill that still followed her like a shadow, through nights when figuring it out meant simply surviving until morning and calling that a victory. What Jasmine didn't know, standing in that kitchen at 4:45, was that in exactly 11 hours, the most dangerous man in Seoul was going to look at her daughter and ask a question that would unravel everything she thought she understood about being invisible. But that's later. First, you need to understand what it actually costs a woman to disappear into her own competence. By 6:15, Jasmine had Zuri dressed, fed, and walking beside her toward the train station, her daughter's small hand gripping two of Jasmine's fingers instead of the whole hand, a habit that had started when Zuri was a toddler and never quite stopped. Zuri talked the entire walk. She always did. Facts about octopuses, a word she'd learned in Korean from a video the night before, a theory about why the moon followed their train. Jasmine listened to all of it, even the parts she'd heard 3 times already, because listening was one of the only things she could give her daughter for free. She dropped Zuri at school with a kiss on the forehead and a promise, always come, always kept, always fragile, that she would see her tonight. Then she ran. She arrived at the office 4 minutes late, breathless, apologizing before anyone had asked her to. Nobody in that building knew her full name outside of Jasmine, and fewer still knew what her mornings actually looked like. To them, she was simply the executive assistant who never seemed to break, the one who could produce a document, calm a client, and reroute a crisis before her coffee went cold. What they didn't understand was that she wasn't doing one person's job. She answered phones that weren't hers to answer. She scheduled meetings for 3 departments that had stopped bothering to schedule their own. She corrected other people's mistakes quietly enough that credit never followed the correction back to her. She smiled through migraines. She apologized for things that weren't her fault, because apologizing was faster than explaining. Nobody in that building had any idea that when 5 o'clock came and the rest of the floor packed up and went home to rest, Jasmine's day was only half finished. At 7, she let herself into a penthouse 3 train stops from her own apartment, using a key given to her by a woman who had never once learned her last name. She changed into old clothes she kept folded in a bag. She cleaned floors that cost more per square foot than her entire apartment building. She scrubbed a marble countertop until it held her reflection. She did not tell her coworkers about this job. She didn't want the conversation that would follow, the tilted heads, the soft voices, the particular flavor of pity that people hand to single mothers, like it's a kindness instead of a weight. During her 15-minute break, sitting on an overturned bucket in a hallway that smelled like bleach and money, she checked her phone. A message from Zuri, sent through the tablet the school lets students use for homework help. "Mommy, are you coming home tonight?" Jasmine smiled despite the exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders like a second job of its own. "Always," she typed back. But if the camera lingered on her face 1 second longer, it would have caught the truth underneath that single word. She was barely holding herself together, and she had gotten remarkably good at making sure nobody ever noticed the seams. By 8:30, her knees ached from scrubbing baseboards that belonged to a family who would never once wonder who kept their floors immaculate. She moved room to room with a bucket in one hand and a rag in the other, polishing surfaces in a home 4 times the size of her own, and there was a strange, quiet irony in it that she'd stopped noticing years ago. She spent her nights making other people's lives look effortless, while her own life required more effort than most people would survive. The owner of the penthouse, a woman named Mrs. O, occasionally left small tips folded beside the sink, sometimes with a note thanking her for her thoroughness. Jasmine appreciated the kindness, but kindness didn't cover a light bill, and gratitude, however sincere, had never once lowered a rent notice. She finished the apartment a little before 10, gathered her bag, and rode the train home, standing the entire way, because sitting felt like giving her body permission to stop, and stopping wasn't something she trusted herself to recover from once she started. She got home a little after 10. Zuri was already asleep, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm, a language app still glowing faintly on the tablet beside her pillow. Jasmine sat on the edge of the bed and watched her daughter breathe, the way she did most nights, as if memorizing the sound could somehow make up for the hours she'd missed. "I'm sorry I wasn't here tonight," she whispered, to a child who was too asleep to hear it and too young to understand that the apology wasn't really about tonight at all. This was Jasmine's deepest fear, the one she never said out loud to anyone. She was providing. She was surviving. But providing and being present were not the same thing, and some nights she lay awake terrified that she was raising a brilliant, curious little girl who would remember her mother's absence far more clearly than her mother's love. What she didn't fully realize was how much of herself she had already given Zuri without meaning to. The languages hadn't come from expensive tutors or elite schools. They'd come from stolen 10-minute windows after dinner, from Jasmine practicing phrases with her daughter because it was the only kind of playtime her exhausted body could still perform, from videos Zuri watched alone while her mother worked a second shift, absorbing sound and rhythm the way only a child that age can. Every language Zuri spoke was, in its own way, a language Jasmine had taught her, out of guilt, out of love, out of desperation to give her daughter something the world hadn't handed either of them. Neither of them knew yet that tomorrow would be the day all of it collided. There was a particular ritual Jasmine performed most nights before finally allowing her own body to rest, one she'd never told anyone about because saying it out loud made it sound smaller than it felt. She would sit at the tiny desk crammed into the corner of her bedroom, open a notebook with a cracked spine, and write down one thing that had gone right that day. Some nights the entry was as small as Zuri smiled at breakfast. Other nights it was harder to find anything at all, and she would sit there for several minutes, searching her exhausted memory for a single fragment of good before finally settling on something like, "I am still standing." She had started the notebook the year Zuri's father left, back when the apartment had felt too big and too quiet, and entirely too frightening to occupy alone with an infant who cried through most nights. She remembered that night more clearly than she wanted to. Marcus had packed a single duffel bag, methodically, almost calmly, as though he'd rehearsed the motion 100 times before finally allowing himself to perform it. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't slammed a single door. He had simply told her, in a voice flattened by whatever guilt he'd managed to bury, that he wasn't built for this kind of life, that fatherhood had turned out to be a weight he hadn't accounted for when he'd said all those things people say before a baby arrives and makes every promise real. Jasmine had stood in the doorway with a 2-year-old on her hip, watching him walk toward a car that would carry him toward a version of freedom she would spend the next 4 years paying for in ways he would never understand. She hadn't cried in front of him. She'd waited until the door closed, until his footsteps faded down the stairwell, until the silence in the apartment pressed in around her so completely that she finally allowed herself to sink to the floor and weep with a 2-year-old still confused and reaching for a father who wasn't coming back. She had promised herself, in that exact moment, sitting on cold linoleum with her daughter's small hand patting her cheek in a toddler's clumsy attempt at comfort, that Zuri would never once feel the absence of a parent as sharply as Jasmine had felt it that night. She hadn't known then how expensive that promise would turn out to be, how many hours of sleep and health and softness it would eventually cost her to keep it. She had only known she intended to keep it no matter what. The notebook had been a lifeline then. It had become a habit since, one small act of defiance against a life that kept insisting she had nothing left to be grateful for. That night she wrote 3 words before closing the cover. "She is brilliant." She didn't know yet how true, and how immediately relevant, those words were about to become. The following morning began normally enough, which should have been the first warning, because in stories like this one, normal never lasts. At noon, Jasmine's phone rang with the school's number, and she felt her stomach drop before she even answered. Zuri had a fever, not dangerously high, but high enough that the school couldn't keep her, high enough that a 6-year-old needed her mother. Jasmine's hands went cold. She could not leave, not today. Today, Kang Junhyun himself was coming to the office for a meeting so important that her supervisor had mentioned it 4 separate times that morning, each mention edged with a warning that barely bothered to disguise itself as encouragement. "If you leave now," her supervisor said, not even looking up from his screen, "don't expect to keep this position." Jasmine stood frozen in the hallway, torn between two versions of failure: fail her daughter, or fail the only job standing between her family and a financial cliff she could already feel beneath her feet. She chose the only option that let her attempt both. She brought Zuri to the office. She settled her daughter into a small, quiet meeting room down the hall, tucked her beneath a spare blazer since there was no blanket, and pressed a kiss to her warm forehead. "Mommy will be right outside," she whispered. "I promise." Zuri, flushed and sleepy, nodded and closed her eyes, the stuffed rabbit pulled tight against her chest. Jasmine shut the door as quietly as she could and returned to her desk, praying to whatever was listening that the meeting would end quickly and nobody important would ever need to open that particular door. The air in the office changed the instant Kang Jun-hyun stepped off the elevator. Conversations died mid-sentence. Movements became smaller, more careful. Even the lights seemed to behave differently around him, as though the building itself understood exactly what kind of man had just entered it. He was cold in the way that ice is cold, not through anger but through sheer, unrelenting control. Silent, mostly, speaking only when speaking accomplished something. Powerful in the way that made grown men adjust their posture without being asked. Jasmine handled his documents with practiced precision, her voice steady, her hands steadier, giving away nothing of the fever burning through her daughter down the hallway. But precision has limits, and Jun-hyun noticed things other people missed for a living. He noticed the way her gaze kept drifting toward a closed door that had nothing to do with the meeting. He noticed the tightness around her eyes that had nothing to do with tiredness and everything to do with fear. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Jasmine's spine straightened instantly. "No, sir." The lie sat between them for exactly 1 second too long. And this is where the story pauses. Because right now, down that hallway, a 6-year-old girl with a fading fever and an empty hand where her mother's fingers should be is starting to wake up. She's going to notice her mother isn't there. She's going to get scared, and she's going to walk somewhere no child should ever wander alone in a building like this one. Before we get there, if this story already has its claws in you, go ahead and drop a comment telling me what you think is about to happen. Because trust me, what happens next is not what you're expecting. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one only get more intense from here. Zuri woke up in an unfamiliar room, disoriented, her skin damp with the last of her fever breaking. She called for her mother once, twice. No answer came. Fear, for a 6-year-old, doesn't announce itself gently. It floods in, all at once, quick and overwhelming. And Zuri slid off the small couch with her rabbit clutched against her chest and pushed the door open, stepping into a hallway that felt enormous and unfamiliar. She wandered, small sneakers silent against expensive flooring, searching each open doorway for a face she recognized. None came. Eventually, she reached a set of elevator doors, silver and gleaming, and pressed the only button she could reach. The doors opened. She stepped inside. The elevator carried her upward, floor numbers climbing past her line of sight, until it stopped, and the doors slid open onto a room she did not belong in. A long table, 8 dangerous men, and a silence so thick it felt like walking into water. She scanned the unfamiliar faces the way lost children do, looking for the one that might help her. "Excuse me," she said. "Has anyone seen my mommy? And now you understand exactly how we got here, exactly how a sick, frightened little girl ended up standing in the middle of Seoul's most feared underworld meeting, armed with nothing but a stuffed rabbit and 16 languages she'd learned from a mother too tired to realize what she'd built." Jun-hyun tested her. She answered. The room went silent, and then he asked the question that mattered more than any of the ones before it. "Why did your mother teach you?" Zuri considered this with the seriousness only children bring to enormous questions. She said, "I should be able to talk to anyone," she answered, "so nobody can ever leave me out." Something in Jun-hyun's expression shifted, subtle enough that only someone who had spent years reading the smallest movements on a man's face would have caught it. It was the answer of a mother who had built her daughter a kind of armor out of vocabulary, a shield made of syllables, because she couldn't afford to give her anything else. That was the moment the door burst open. Jasmine ran into the room, chest heaving, eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with her employer and everything to do with the empty meeting room she'd just discovered. She saw her daughter standing at the head of the most dangerous table in the city. She saw Kang Jun-hyun watching her daughter with an expression she'd never seen him wear. Her knees nearly gave out. "I am so sorry," she said, the words tumbling over each other, already reaching for Zuri, already preparing herself for the unemployment that was about to follow. She wasn't supposed to. She was sick. I didn't have anyone. I didn't think. She expected fury. She expected to be escorted out of the building within the hour, her badge deactivated before she even reached the elevator. Instead, Jun-hyun asked a question that had nothing to do with any of it. "How long has she been here?" Jasmine blinked, thrown off balance by the absence of anger. "A few hours. She had a fever. I didn't have childcare. I didn't want to lose. Where is her father?" The room, already silent, seemed to hold its breath differently now. Jasmine's jaw tightened. "He's not around." Jun-hyun looked at Zuri, who was watching the exchange with the open curiosity of a child, who understood something important was happening, even if she couldn't name it. Then his gaze returned to Jasmine, lingering a moment longer than professionalism required. Something in him, quiet and unfamiliar, had just shifted. He dismissed the room shortly after, a curt wave of his hand that sent 8 dangerous men filing silently toward the elevator without a single word of protest, none of them daring to ask why the most feared man in Seoul had just spent 10 minutes testing a child's vocabulary instead of finishing a conversation about smuggled cargo. When the last of them disappeared behind the closing doors, only 3 people remained in that vast room: Jun-hyun, Jasmine, and a 6-year-old still holding tight to a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. "Sit," Jun-hyun said, gesturing not at Jasmine, but at the chair nearest him, and for a strange, disorienting moment, Jasmine wasn't certain whether the invitation was meant as kindness or interrogation. She sat anyway, pulling Zuri onto her lap, one arm wrapped protectively around her daughter's small frame. He asked more questions after that, gentler ones, though his voice never quite lost its edge of authority. He asked how long Jasmine had worked for the company. He asked whether anyone had ever offered her assistance with childcare. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she was aware her file listed her as an assistant when her actual responsibilities, judging by what he'd observed over the past several months, more closely resembled those of an operations manager. Jasmine, still bracing for consequences that never arrived, answered each question carefully, unsure what kind of trap she might be walking into. She had learned, through years of hard experience, that powerful men rarely asked questions out of pure curiosity. There was usually an angle. There was usually a cost, hiding behind the kindness. But as the conversation continued, she began to suspect, cautiously, that this particular man might be the exception. Over the days that followed, Jun-hyun began noticing things about Jasmine that had nothing to do with paperwork. He noticed she skipped lunch more often than she ate it. He noticed she worked through headaches that made her squint at her monitor, refusing painkillers she probably couldn't afford anyway. He noticed she stayed later than anyone else on the floor, and that she never once complained about it, not even to the coworkers who complained about far less. He noticed she checked on her daughter obsessively whenever Zuri was in the building, a habit that had started that fevered afternoon and never fully stopped. He noticed, most of all, that she refused help the way other people refuse insults. One evening, working later than he should have, he passed her desk and found her asleep in her chair, head tilted at an angle that promised a stiff neck by morning, a half-finished document glowing on her screen. He woke her gently. She startled, instantly awake, already apologizing before her eyes had fully focused. "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "When did you last sleep?" he asked. She laughed, short and humorless. "I don't know." That answer stayed with him longer than it should have. It was around this time he discovered, almost by accident, that Jasmine held a second job. A colleague mentioned offhandedly that they'd seen her leaving a residential building downtown in cleaning clothes. Jun-hyun said nothing at the time, but the next morning he asked her directly, watching her face carefully as she answered. "You work here all day," he said. "Yes? And then?" "I work somewhere else." "Why?" Jasmine met his eyes, and for the first time, something in her voice cracked open just slightly, revealing the exhaustion she usually kept locked behind competence. Because being a mother doesn't pause just because you're tired. He didn't respond right away. He didn't know how to. Nobody had ever said anything like that to him before, not with that particular blend of exhaustion and defiance, and it lodged itself somewhere in his chest he hadn't realized was still capable of feeling anything at all. From then on, he began asking about Zuri more than he asked about the shipment schedules or the quarterly reports that used to consume his every conversation. He learned that Jasmine didn't want money for herself. She wanted her daughter to have chances she'd never had, to travel somewhere that wasn't a screen, to study something that wasn't survival, to grow into whoever she wanted without being shaped entirely by scarcity. Jun-hyun began to see Jasmine as something he hadn't encountered often in his line of work. A person who had endured years of hardship without letting that hardship curdle into bitterness. Around men, that kind of survival usually produced hardness. In her, it had produced something closer to quiet, stubborn grace. There was an afternoon not long after when Jun-hyun found himself lingering near her desk longer than any legitimate task required, watching her fingers move across a keyboard with the same precision she brought to everything, and he realized, with a discomfort he wasn't used to feeling, that he had begun rearranging his schedule around the small windows of time when she was most likely to be free. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself it was simply appreciation for competence, the same appreciation he held for any asset that performed beyond expectation. He did not yet have the vocabulary to call it anything else, because nobody had ever taught him the word for wanting someone's company without wanting something from them in return. One of his lieutenants, a broad-shouldered man named Sung-min who had served him since they were both teenagers, clawing their way up through a world that rewarded ruthlessness over kindness, noticed the shift before Jun-hyun was willing to admit it existed. "You're different around her," Sung-min said one evening, watching his boss's gaze drift toward the glass partition separating his office from the assistant's floor. "I don't know what you mean," Jun-hyun replied too quickly. Sung-min said nothing further, but the small, knowing smile on his face lingered long after the conversation ended, and it followed Jun-hyun into a restlessness he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember, a restlessness that felt dangerously close to hope. But before this story can move any further into whatever this was becoming, you need to understand exactly who Kang Jun-hyun was before Jasmine Carter ever walked into his periphery. Because a man doesn't build an empire out of silence and control without something underneath it that taught him silence was the only safe language. He grew up surrounded by violence disguised as discipline. His father, a man feared even by men who feared nothing, had raised him with a single unspoken lesson, repeated in 1,000 different forms. Weakness gets people killed. Softness invites betrayal. Anyone you allow close enough to matter is a vulnerability you will eventually have to defend or bury. Jun-hyun had learned that lesson so thoroughly it had calcified into personality. He didn't understand family. Not really. Not the version that involved warmth instead of obligation. He understood loyalty as leverage. He understood control as the closest thing to safety he'd ever been offered. And then a 6-year-old girl started wandering into his office uninvited, asking him questions no subordinate would ever dare to ask. "Why do you always wear black?" He'd stared at her, momentarily speechless, the way he never was in negotiations worth millions. "Why are your men scared of you?" He'd answered that one honestly, mostly because he didn't know how to lie to her, the way he lied to everyone else. And then, one afternoon, with the devastating bluntness only small children possess, she'd tilted her head and asked, "Do you have a girlfriend?" Jun-hyun had nearly choked on his own coffee. Jasmine, mortified, had rushed in to apologize for her daughter's directness, her face burning with embarrassment, while Zuri looked utterly unbothered by the chaos she'd caused. It was, against every possible expectation, funny. It gave this dark, controlled, dangerous man something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember, a moment of genuine, unguarded warmth. These visits became a quiet ritual neither of them acknowledged out loud. Zuri would arrive with the tablet Jasmine had bought her secondhand, a battered thing with a cracked corner that still somehow ran every language app it needed to, and she would settle into the enormous leather chair across from Jun-hyun's desk as though she belonged there, swinging her legs because they didn't yet reach the floor. Say something in Korean, she'd demand, and he would oblige, watching her repeat the phrase back with a precision that startled him every time, as though her brain simply absorbed sound the way other children absorbed cartoons. Now say it angry, she'd instruct next, and he would deliver the same phrase with a clipped severity that had once made grown men flinch, and Zuri would collapse into giggles, utterly unbothered by the fact that this particular tone had ended careers and occasionally lives. There was an afternoon she brought a worksheet from school, a simple assignment asking students to draw their family, and she spread it across his desk with the unself-conscious confidence only children possess, drawing herself and her mother in careful crayon, then pausing, tapping the crayon against her chin, before adding a third figure standing slightly apart from the other two. "Who is that?" Jun-hyun asked, though something in his chest had already guessed the answer before she said it. "That's you," Zuri said simply, as though it required no further explanation. "You're not all the way in the family yet, but you're getting closer." She tapped the crayon figure again, considering it with the critical eye of an artist unsatisfied with a small detail. "I drew you without a frown," she added, "because you don't actually frown that much when it's just us. You only do the scary face for other people." Jun-hyun found himself momentarily unable to answer, struck by the accuracy of an observation no adult in his life had ever bothered to make, let alone say to his face with such casual certainty. Jun-hyun didn't trust himself to respond to that immediately. He'd negotiated deals worth more money than most countries generated in a year without his composure slipping, and yet a 6-year-old's crayon drawing had very nearly undone him entirely. He cleared his throat, straightened a folder that didn't need straightening, and eventually managed a quiet thank you that came out rougher than he intended. Zuri, apparently satisfied with his reaction, folded the worksheet carefully and tucked it into her backpack, already moving on to her next question, unaware that she'd just handed a feared crime boss the first piece of evidence he'd ever received that he might be capable of belonging somewhere. But warmth wasn't the only thing waiting around the corner. Jasmine had been pushing herself past every reasonable limit for weeks, and bodies eventually collect the bill for debts like that. She collapsed one evening in the hallway outside the executive offices, her legs simply giving out beneath her, the second job and the double shifts, and the years of insufficient sleep finally cashing in all at once. Jun-hyun caught her before she hit the floor. She woke in his private medical room, disoriented, an IV taped to the back of her hand, and the first thing she saw was him standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, jaw tight, with something that looked dangerously close to fear. "You were going to keep working until you collapsed?" he asked, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it directed at her. "I don't have a choice," she said. "You do now." Jasmine sat up too fast, wincing, already bracing herself against whatever this was turning into. She had spent her entire adult life refusing to be somebody's charity case, and she wasn't about to start now, not even for the most powerful man in Seoul. "I don't need a rich man to fix my life," she said. "I know," Jun-hyun answered, and the calm certainty in his voice threw her off balance more than an argument would have. "Then what do you want?" "I don't want to fix your life," he said. "I want to know why you think you have to carry it alone." Jasmine had no answer for that. Nobody had ever asked her that question before, not in 6 years of carrying everything by herself, and something in her chest cracked open in a way she hadn't given anyone permission to touch. From that point forward, Jun-hyun didn't try to rescue her. He simply started removing obstacles without demanding credit for it. Better hours appeared on her schedule. Paid leave, health care, reliable childcare. All of it arrived not as gifts, but as corrections to a system that had failed her for years. A promotion followed, one built entirely on the competence she'd already proven 100 times over, never once framed as anything she hadn't earned. Slowly, carefully, Jasmine began to trust him. Trust, for a woman who had built her entire adult life on the assumption that she could depend on no one but herself, did not arrive easily or all at once. It arrived in fragments, in the way he never once mentioned the money he'd quietly rerouted toward her benefits, in the way he asked about Zuri's school project before he asked about the quarterly numbers, in the way he simply showed up, again and again, without ever demanding acknowledgement for showing up. There was an evening when Zuri fell asleep on the office couch waiting for her mother to finish a late meeting, and Jasmine emerged to find Jun-hyun sitting beside her sleeping daughter, perfectly still, a dangerous man reduced to something almost tender by the presence of a child he had no obligation to protect. He looked up when Jasmine entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence saying more than either was ready to say out loud. "She talks about you," Jasmine finally admitted, voice soft so as not to wake Zuri. "At home. She asks if you're coming to visit." Jun-hyun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, an old habit of controlling emotion before it controlled him. "And what do you tell her?" "I tell her I don't know," Jasmine said, "because I don't." He held her gaze a moment longer than professional distance allowed, and something unspoken passed between them, heavier than either was prepared to name. And just as something fragile and real was beginning to take root between them, the ground shifted beneath her feet in the worst possible way. Zuri's biological father resurfaced. He arrived without warning, sharp-suited and smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. And it took less than a week for Jasmine to understand exactly why he'd chosen this particular moment to reappear after years of complete silence. He'd heard rumors about a powerful man, rumors about money circling closer to Jasmine's life than it ever had before. He demanded custody. He stood in front of a judge and accused Jasmine of being an unfit mother, citing the very sacrifices that had kept Zuri fed, clothed, and safe as evidence of neglect. Too many hours worked, too little supervision. A daughter raised, he claimed, by absence disguised as ambition. Jasmine was devastated in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in years. Everything she had bled herself dry to provide was suddenly being twisted into a weapon against her, wielded by the one person who had never once picked up that weight himself. Jun-hyun's fury was immediate and absolute. He wanted to destroy the man entirely, to make the threat disappear the way threats in his world usually disappeared. But Jasmine stopped him with a single sentence that silenced even him. "I need to win this as Zuri's mother, not as anyone's charity case." Jun-hyun respected that with a restraint that cost him more than violence ever would have. He didn't fix it for her. He simply stood beside her, present in a way he had never learned how to be present for anyone before. The hearing itself took place in a courthouse that felt almost absurdly ordinary given the weight of what was happening inside it. Fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum, a judge who looked profoundly unimpressed by everyone seated before her. Zuri's father, a man named Marcus, sat across the room in a suit that fit too well for someone who had contributed nothing to a single school fee in 4 years. His lawyer painting a picture of Jasmine so distorted, it barely resembled the woman who had spent 6 years sacrificing sleep, health, and every ounce of comfort for her daughter's sake. Jasmine sat rigid beside her own attorney, hands clenched in her lap, listening to strangers debate her worth as a mother, using language cold enough to make her stomach twist. Every missed recital blamed on her exhaustion was recited as evidence. Every late pickup caused by a second job nobody had offered to help her avoid was read aloud as neglect. It took everything in her not to stand up and scream that the very system now judging her had never once offered her the support it now claimed she'd failed to provide her daughter. Jun-hyun sat 2 rows behind her, silent, his presence a quiet anchor she could feel even without turning around, though she had insisted, firmly, that he not speak on her behalf. This was hers to fight. She needed to win it as herself, not as the woman standing beside a powerful man. But here's where this story stops being simple, because the timing of that man's return was never a coincidence, and the truth behind it is about to detonate everything Jasmine thought she understood about the danger circling her daughter. During the custody hearing, in a small, sterile room that felt nothing like the courtroom dramas people imagine, Zuri's father attempted something Jasmine hadn't anticipated. He tried to coach her daughter beforehand, feeding her phrases designed to paint her mother as absent, unstable, unfit. Zuri, sitting in a chair too large for her, looked directly at the man who shared her blood and told the truth instead. She explained how her mother woke before the sun every single day, how she packed lunches with notes written in different languages, how she came home exhausted and still found 10 minutes to practice words with her daughter, because those 10 minutes mattered more than sleep. She explained, with a devastating clarity no adult in that room expected from a child, that she had once seen her mother crying quietly at the edge of her bed, believing Zuri was asleep, and that Zuri had pretended to stay asleep because some part of her understood her mother needed that privacy more than she needed comforting. Marcus's lawyer tried at one point to rattle her, leaning forward with a practiced gentleness that fooled no one paying close attention. "Zuri," he said, "isn't it true your mother is sometimes too tired to help you with homework?" Zuri considered this with the same seriousness she gave every important question. "Sometimes she falls asleep on the couch," she admitted, and for one terrible second, Jasmine felt the floor tilt beneath her, certain the admission had just handed Marcus exactly what he wanted. "But she always wakes up and finishes helping me. Even if it's really late, even if her eyes look really tired, she never just leaves it for tomorrow." The lawyer, clearly unprepared for a 6-year-old to answer with that kind of devastating honesty, tried a different angle. "And your father? Do you remember him?" Zuri looked across the room at Marcus, studying him the way she'd once studied Junhyun, before deciding whether he deserved her 16 languages. "Not really," she said. "He wasn't there for the parts I remember." Then Zuri said the sentence that ended the argument entirely. "My mommy doesn't need someone to save her." The room went silent, the same particular silence that had swallowed a Mafia meeting weeks earlier. "She just needs someone to stay." Junhyun looked at Jasmine as those words landed, and something in his controlled, unreadable expression finally, completely broke open. Jasmine pressed a hand over her mouth, tears sliding free before she could stop them, undone by her own 6-year-old daughter in a way nothing else in her life had managed to undo her. The custody case collapsed within the hour, but that same evening, as Jasmine sat in her apartment finally allowing herself to breathe, a message arrived on Junhyun's private line, from a contact he trusted completely, a message that confirmed something far darker than a bitter father chasing money. Zuri's father hadn't returned on his own. He'd been paid by a rival organization that had spent months searching for a crack in Kang Junhyun's armor, and had finally found one in the shape of a woman he'd started to love, and a little girl who had learned to speak 16 languages, so nobody could ever leave her out. They hadn't wanted custody at all. They'd wanted leverage. And the message ended with 4 words that turned Junhyun's blood to ice. "They know where she sleeps." Junhyun read the message 3 times before setting his phone face down on the counter, his mind already moving through a dozen contingencies at once, the particular cold calculation that had kept him alive through decades of exactly this kind of war. He thought of Sungmin's warning weeks earlier, a passing comment about unfamiliar men asking questions in neighborhoods that had no reason to be asked about. He thought of the timing of Marcus's reappearance, suspiciously precise, arriving just as Jasmine's name had started circulating in conversations she had no idea she was part of. He thought, most of all, of a 6-year-old girl who had walked into a room full of killers without an ounce of fear, because nobody had ever taught her that the world contained people capable of using a child as a bargaining chip. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with a glass of untouched whiskey and a phone full of names he hadn't called in years, men who owed him favors steep enough to matter, and he began, quietly and methodically, to prepare for a war he had no intention of losing. By dawn, Sungmin arrived with a folder of his own, thicker than the one Junhyun had already received, containing photographs that made the muscles in his jaw tighten with a fury he hadn't felt in years. Surveillance images of Jasmine leaving the penthouse she cleaned at night. Photographs of Zuri walking home from school, taken from a distance close enough to turn Junhyun's blood to ice. And beneath it all, a name he recognized instantly, a name belonging to a rival organization that had spent the better part of a decade trying to carve territory away from him through methods far dirtier than open warfare. "They've been watching for 6 weeks, Sungmin said quietly. "Since the day the girl walked into that meeting. Someone talked. Someone in this building told them exactly what she means to you before you even knew it yourself." Junhyun closed the folder slowly, his hands steadier than the storm building behind his eyes. "Find out who," he said, "and find out everything else they think they know." Sungmin hesitated at the door before leaving. "And Jasmine? Do we tell her?" Junhyun was quiet for a long moment, staring at a photograph of Zuri laughing on a school playground, utterly unaware that she'd become a pawn in a war she hadn't chosen and didn't yet know existed. "Not yet," he finally said. Not until I know exactly how much danger I've already put them in by letting myself care. The admission cost him more than he expected it to, spoken aloud for the first time to another living person, and it settled into the room like a confession he could never fully take back. It took Sung-min less than 2 days to find the leak, and when he did, the answer landed with a weight neither of them had anticipated. It wasn't a rival lieutenant or a disgruntled worker passed over for promotion or any of the usual suspects who typically betrayed men like Jun-hyun for money or ambition. It was Jasmine's own supervisor, the same man who had warned her, months earlier, that leaving for a sick child would cost her the position she'd fought so hard to keep. He'd noticed the shift long before anyone else, the extra minutes Jun-hyun spent near her desk, the sudden appearance of benefits nobody else on the floor had access to, the unmistakable softness in a man who had built his entire reputation on having none. Resentment, it turned out, made for a remarkably efficient informant. He'd been passed over for a leadership role he believed belonged to him, a role that had gone instead to someone he considered beneath him, and when a stranger had approached him in a parking garage offering a considerable sum for information about Kang Jun-hyun's personal life, he hadn't hesitated nearly long enough. Sung-min delivered this information to Jun-hyun with the flat, careful tone of a man who understood exactly how dangerous his boss's reaction was about to be. Jun-hyun said nothing for a long moment, staring out the window of his office at the city spread below, a city he had spent 2 decades learning to control through fear alone. He thought of Jasmine's exhausted eyes the first week he'd truly seen her. He thought of Zuri's fearless curiosity, the way she asked questions nobody else dared to ask him. He thought of how easily, how carelessly, his own men had turned the two of them into currency, simply by noticing that he'd finally let himself care about something. "Bring him to me," Jun-hyun said quietly. "Tonight." Sung-min hesitated, an unusual pause for a man who rarely questioned an order. "He has a family, Jun-hyun. A wife, 2 kids in middle school." Jun-hyun turned back toward the window, jaw tight, the muscle there ticking once before settling. He thought of Zuri's crayon drawing, the third figure standing slightly apart, getting closer. He thought of a stranger in a parking garage handing that same man an envelope thick enough to sell out a child's safety for a promotion he hadn't earned. "So did the people whose lives he was willing to trade for a title," Jun-hyun said. "I'm not going to touch his family. I want him to understand exactly what he almost cost 2 people who never did anything to him. That's all. Words first. Whether it stays words is entirely his choice." Sung-min nodded once, already reaching for his phone, and left without further argument, understanding that whatever restraint remained in his old friend was being held together by nothing more than the memory of a little girl's laughter down a hallway, 3 floors above a car full of men counting down the hours until morning. "And the men watching the apartment?" Sung-min asked. Jun-hyun's expression didn't change, but something in his voice dropped several degrees colder. "Let them watch," he said. "Let them see exactly what happens to anyone who mistakes what I feel for her as a weakness they can exploit." He turned from the window, and for the first time since Sung-min had known him, he saw something in his old friend's eyes that looked less like calculated control and more like a man prepared to burn everything down to protect 2 people who had never asked to be caught in the middle of his war. Across the city, Jasmine had no idea any of this was happening. She sat at her kitchen table finishing the last of the custody paperwork, relief settling into her bones for the first time in weeks, unaware that the danger her daughter had just survived in a courtroom was nothing compared to the one now circling closer with every passing hour. She checked on Zuri once more before bed, smoothed the blanket over her daughter's shoulders, and allowed herself, finally, to believe the worst was behind her. It wasn't. If this story already has you holding your breath, this is exactly the moment to comment the words Part 2 down below, because what happens in the next 24 hours changes absolutely everything you think you understand about this story, and I am not finished telling it. Months seemed to pass in the story Jasmine wanted to believe she was living. She'd been promoted, her health had steadied. She had more evenings with Zuri than she'd had in years, more mornings that didn't start with a bank balance carved into her chest like a warning. Zuri kept learning languages, one after another, collecting them the way other children collect stickers. Jun-hyun had slowly, carefully, become part of the rhythm of their lives, though he still hadn't found the courage to ask Jasmine the one question that mattered most. One evening, standing in her kitchen with a hesitance that looked almost unfamiliar on a man who commanded rooms without trying, he finally did. "Jasmine? Yes? Would you have dinner with me?" She smiled, unable to help the small tilt of amusement in her voice. "As your employee?" He shook his head, his gaze steady, unguarded in a way she'd never seen from him. "As the woman I can't stop thinking about." Before Jasmine could answer, before the words she wanted to say could even form themselves, Zuri appeared in the doorway behind them, arms crossed, expression far too serious for a child in pajamas covered in stars. "Mommy, are you finally getting a boyfriend?" Jasmine froze. Junhyun turned to look at the small girl who had walked into a Mafia meeting and rewritten the trajectory of his entire life without even realizing it. "Apparently," he said, "I need to pass another interview." Zuri folded her arms tighter. "I speak 16 languages. I have questions." And it should have ended there, warm and soft and almost enough to let the audience exhale. But 3 floors below that apartment, in a car parked with its headlights off, 2 men were watching the building, waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet, holding a folder with photographs of Jasmine, of Zuri, of a woman who had no idea her happiness had just made her the single most valuable piece of leverage in a war she didn't even know was happening. The man in the passenger seat, older, patient, scrolled through the photographs with the detached focus of someone who had done this kind of work for a long time. He paused on an image of Zuri, taken through a school fence, her small face caught mid-laugh at something only she found funny. "The girl makes this easy," he said. "He'll break every rule he's ever followed to protect her. Men like Kang Junhyun don't survive their own softness." The driver said nothing, his eyes fixed on the lit window 3 floors up, where 2 shadows moved together behind thin curtains, close enough to suggest an embrace neither of them could clearly see. "Boss wants to know when," the driver finally said. The older man closed the folder and checked the time on his watch, unhurried, certain. "Not tonight," he said. "Let him have tonight. Let him believe, for one more evening, that he's finally allowed to want something without it being taken from him." A slow, humorless smile crossed his face as he leaned back into the seat, the headlights of a passing car briefly illuminating features that belonged to a man who had learned, a long time ago, that the cruelest strikes were always the ones delivered right after hope. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow we remind him exactly what happens to men who forget what they are. Because the man who paid Zuri's father to return wasn't finished. He'd only been testing how close he could get. And now that he knew exactly how close that was, the real plan was about to begin." Upstairs, unaware of the car idling below, unaware of the folder full of photographs documenting every unguarded moment of the life she'd finally allowed herself to want, Jasmine stood in her kitchen, with her hands still resting in Junhyun's, her daughter's laughter still echoing from the hallway, where Zuri had run to retrieve a list of questions she intended to ask her mother's almost boyfriend before granting her approval. For the first time in 6 years, Jasmine allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't require her to carry every single piece of it alone. She thought, briefly, of the notebook still sitting in her nightstand drawer, its pages filled with years of small, hard-won victories scribbled down on nights when victory was the only word she had strength left to reach for. She thought about what she might write tonight, after Zuri finally exhausted her list of interview questions and fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, and she realized, with something close to disbelief, that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wouldn't have to search for the good in the day. Tonight, the good was standing right in front of her, asking permission to stay. She thought of the years spent whispering, "We'll figure it out," into empty kitchens and darkened bedrooms, a promise made mostly to convince herself, and she realized she finally believed it as more than survival. It felt, for the first time, like something closer to hope. She had no way of knowing that future was about to be tested in ways that would make everything she'd already survived look like the easy part. If you made it this far, comment the words Part 2 right now if you need to know what happens to Jasmine, to Zuri, and to the empire Junhyun is about to burn to the ground to protect them. Because trust me, this story is far from over, and what's coming next will change everything you think you understand about the man in black and the woman who taught her daughter 16 ways to never be left out. If this story gripped you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you want part 2, and tell me in the comments what you think those men in that car are waiting for. See you in the next one.